So by show of hands, how many of you have ever been inside a prison? Okay, a few of us. So if you raise your hand, you probably have some very vivid memories of what that experience was like. For the rest of you, I'd like to describe my experience because it was one of the most scary, anxiety-producing moments of my professional life to date. So this is Haynesville Correctional Facility. And in February of 2012, I was instructed by my dean at Rappahannock Community College to proctor a placement at Haynesville Correctional Facility for about 25 students. At that point, I'd been working at the college a whopping 30 days. I'm always a little nervous when I enter a classroom and meet students for the first time, but on that first day, I was a lot nervous. I sat in the state car in the parking lot, looked up at the guard tower, at the fence, at all the barbed wire on top of the fence, and psyched myself up. I entered the prison, nervously slid my ID to the very surly guard at the security checkpoint window, and after a few minutes of methodical inspection, the guard ushered me over to the x-ray machine and to the metal detector, where both my class materials and I went through a rigorous inspection for contraband. I won't give you a lot of details about what that process was like, but I will say it was invasive, and I still think someone should have bought me dinner first. Standing in between the gate that closed behind me and then the gate that was going to open in front of me, I found myself thinking, what in the world am I doing here? When I reflected later, I realized that's the same question that many of our students ask themselves when they come to our campus. But like many of our students, I kept going. I made it all the way to the education building, proudly introduced myself to the class. Unfortunately, the little bit of confidence I had mustered was quickly tested when my students began to protest my instructions. I announced we were going to take the English and the math portion of the placement test, and they insisted they had been given instructions only to study for the English portion, and that they would have studied for the math as well if someone had told them. In that moment, all of my security training at the prison came flooding back to me. Don't let them manipulate you. Incarcerated students can be manipulative. You have to show you're in charge. And by the way, make sure no pins are missing because they can be weapons. So, given my desire to set the right tone, I insisted that we were doing both portions of the placement test. It turns out later, I found that they were correct. I was only supposed to administer the English section, not the English and the math section. You can imagine how humbling that was for me. Needless to say, by the end of that day, a lot of my assumptions about my students and who they were and were not were proven wrong. While the process of getting into the classroom was very different than what I'd experienced before, the classroom itself and the interaction with the students was very similar to what I experienced on campus. In fact, there was really only one notable difference, and that difference was that these students seemed even more dedicated and even more engaged than most of the students I worked with on campus. It was as if they realized that this was their shot at a second chance. I was completely hooked. Luckily, many of my colleagues at Rappahannock Community College have also been hooked after teaching at the college for the first time, the college's prison program. And I'm proud to say that for 10 years now, we've been operating a prison program at Haynesville Correctional Facility. The colleague you see here on the screen started the program in 2008 and has evolved over the years through the generous funding from the Sunshine Lady Foundation and the Laughing Gull Foundation. But as we all know, like Cinderella at the ball, grant funding doesn't last forever. And you can imagine our excitement when the Department of Education announced they were accepting applications for an experimental site initiative to provide Pell Grants to incarcerated students. We quickly prepared our application and were lucky enough to be selected as one of only 67 Second Chance Pell sites nationally. And if you've never heard the term Second Chance Pell, it represents a big change in our current policy. In the 1990s and the tough on crime era, incarcerated students lost the ability to receive Pell Grants. So you might be wondering, why does prison education matter so much? And the first reason is it's a very effective, very powerful intervention. A 2013 study by the RAND Corporation found that incarcerated students were 43% less likely to recidivate if they took part in a college program while they were incarcerated. 43%. That same study found that for every dollar spent, $5 were saved on reincarceration costs. Dollar for dollar, it's hard to find a more powerful, more cost-effective intervention than that. But I'm preaching to the choir. We know that education is important and powerful because it's more important than just saving money. It's about changing lives. So because of that, I'd like to tell you some student stories and that illustrate the power of our work. Sharing these stories may seem like a simple idea, but it's a profound one. As educators, we're in a powerful position to share the stories of those our society may not deem worthy of receiving an education. Through sharing these stories, everyone, whether teacher, administrator, or student, can be transformed. The first student I'd like to tell you about is John. John is working on his associate's degree in arts and sciences and has 2 children, a son and a daughter. And John, as many of our students do, calls home frequently, and often his children are talking about homework because it's an important part of elementary school students' lives, right? And he let us know that he was very anxious about that because he often didn't have the knowledge to help them with their homework. But a few months ago, he told his instructor that he finally felt like he could offer his kids some assistance when he called home, and he knew something about the work that they were doing in class. I'd like for you to imagine for a moment how powerful that moment was when John shifted how he looked at himself. He looked at himself as not just an incarcerated student, but as a student who could help his children. I'd also like for you to imagine how powerful that was for his children to see their father differently and see themselves as students differently. His story and the story of his children started to change that day. I'd like to tell you about Mark, another one of our students. Mark is probably one of our most engaged students from the prison program, and he's worked with us in the associate's degree program since 2015. He was so dedicated and so engaged, he really became an informal part of our team that worked for student success inside the prison. He became a student mentor and a tutor for his fellow students. And I'm glad to say that 2 weeks ago, Mark was released and is now sitting in a classroom on campus, finishing his classes for the semester, and he'll finish his associate's degree in May of 2019. So I'd like for you to reflect a minute on the power of that moment, how Mark is seeing himself differently because he was an incarcerated student and now he's a student. He's looking around the classroom, realizing that some of the barriers that he worked so hard to overcome have changed. And he's 15 credits away from graduation. But I also want you to think about how powerful that is for other students in the classroom who may be thinking, what am I doing here? Because there are barriers in their way and they get discouraged. But they see Mark and they realize, just like Mark, they can do it. Can you imagine the depth of hope that experience offers for both of them when they see people succeed despite great odds and great barriers? Of course, as an administrator, I always like interventions that we can track longitudinally, metrics we can report to the state, like many of us do. But it's these stories, the stories of individual men and women, that remind me why our work is so vitally important. Before I go, there's one last person I'd like to tell you about. Her name is Julie, and we met at a Second Chance Pell convening in Detroit this spring. We were engaged in work where we were all designing an elevator speech to talk to administrators and legislators who might be in a position to restore Pell funding for incarcerated students, but we've been given the guideline that what would we say to someone who supported restoring Pell unless someone was a lifer? Right now, the guideline for Second Chance Pell eligibility is that you have to be within 5 years of release to be eligible, so lifers are not eligible. So many of you are probably thinking, that sounds like a reasonable guideline, right? Why would we spend scarce education dollars on someone who may never be released? And I thought the same thing until Julie's story changed my thinking. She explained that in her many years of correctional work, she had seen how transformative prison education could be, not just for those students who were going to be released, but for everyone within the prison walls. She painted a compelling picture for me of individuals serving life who went from being angry and often violent to being centered and full of purpose, and even serving as tutors for other students who would be released and go on and further their education. She talked about the ripple effect that these changes had on prison staff and leadership and the entire environment in the prison. The culture was transformed by education. Ultimately, Julie reminded me that if education is transformative, it can be transformative for everyone. Let me say that again. If education is transformative, it can be transformative for everyone. Thank you.